It was a typical day in March 2020 when the world was locked in a new kind of reality. The pandemic had turned normal life upside down. For most, it was a time of isolation, working from home, and virtual hangouts. But for one woman, Gretchen Anthony, the comfort of a Zoom call turned into a nightmare that would end her life. Her shocking disappearance left a community in horror and a family desperate for answers. This is the chilling story of Gretchen Anthony, a woman whose tragic end began on a video call, a call that would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Gretchen Anthony was a vibrant woman in her 40s, full of life, and a beloved member of her community. Born and raised in a small town in Florida, she was the kind of person who lit up a room with her smile. A social worker by profession, Gretchen had a career helping others, always putting others before herself. But beneath her warm exterior, she was dealing with a darker, more personal struggle. In 2019, Gretchen had met David Anthony, a man who seemed to be the perfect match at first. He was charming, attentive, and affectionate, sweeping her off her feet. They quickly became a couple, and by the following year, they were living together. But as time went on, cracks began to form in their relationship. David's jealousy and possessiveness grew. He would often monitor Gretchen's phone and social media accounts, checking her messages and even going as far as to demand access to her personal devices. Friends began noticing how controlling he had become, how he would show up unannounced, how he seemed to try to isolate her from her family and friends. Despite her growing discomfort, Gretchen stayed with David. But in the spring of 2020, everything would change. On March 20, 2020, Gretchen Anthony made plans to video chat with a close friend. They had been speaking regularly over Zoom during the lockdown, as many others were doing to stay connected in a world of isolation. The day started like any other. Gretchen was chatting with her friend, laughing, and sharing stories. But at one point during the call, something went eerily silent. Her friend recalls seeing Gretchen's face freeze on the screen, as if she was shocked or stunned. The connection faltered, and Gretchen suddenly disappeared from the call. At first, her friend thought it was just a glitch. Maybe it was the internet, or perhaps a sudden technical issue. But when she tried to call back, there was no answer. Gretchen had vanished. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Texts and emails went unanswered. The next day, her family began to worry. Something didn't seem right. Gretchen was a creature of habit. She always kept in touch, especially during such a confusing time as the lockdown. So why had she gone silent? Days passed with no sign of Gretchen. Her family and friends grew desperate. They reported her missing to the police, and the investigation into her disappearance began. The authorities quickly turned their attention to Gretchen's boyfriend, David Anthony. At first, David seemed cooperative. He told police that he had no idea where Gretchen was. But as investigators dug deeper into his background, they uncovered troubling information. David had a history of violent behavior, including a previous charge of domestic violence against a former partner. This gave investigators the first clue that the case might not be as straightforward as it seemed. The police soon learned that the day Gretchen disappeared, David was acting suspiciously. He had made several phone calls to Gretchen's family, but his tone was oddly calm, almost too calm for someone whose girlfriend had just vanished. It was as if he knew exactly where she was, but wasn't saying anything. A major break in the case came when police obtained access to Gretchen's phone records. They discovered a series of strange text messages that had been sent from her phone after her disappearance. The messages were carefully crafted, almost as if someone was trying to make it seem like Gretchen was still alive. One of the messages, sent to her mother, said, "I'm fine, don't worry, I'm just going to lay low for a while." But Gretchen's family knew something was off. The messages didn't sound like her. They weren't written in her usual casual tone, and the phrasing was unusual. It was clear that someone had been posing as Gretchen. David was now the primary suspect. Investigators questioned him further, and eventually, the cracks began to show. David's story began to unravel. Volunteers, law enforcement, and family members scoured the area, searching for any sign of Gretchen. But as the days turned into weeks, the search seemed hopeless. David remained eerily silent, continuing to deny any involvement. But police knew that something was very wrong. The search for Gretchen would soon take a darker turn. On April 1st, just days after Gretchen had been reported missing, authorities received an anonymous tip. A woman had seen something strange near a remote area outside town, and her instincts told her it might be related to the case. When police arrived at the location, they discovered a bag with Gretchen's belongings inside. They found her wallet, her phone, and some personal items, but no sign of Gretchen. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was clear that someone had tried to cover their tracks, but what had happened to Gretchen? Where was she? And, most chillingly, why had someone gone to such great lengths to erase her existence? As detectives pieced together the timeline of events, a chilling conclusion emerged. David had been behind Gretchen's disappearance all along, but the discovery of her body would shock everyone. As the investigation progressed, David's involvement became undeniable. The police had gathered enough evidence to charge him, but there was still no sign of Gretchen. The search continued, but investigators were becoming more focused on finding answers. It was at this crucial moment that David decided to speak up. Under intense questioning, David broke down and confessed. He admitted that Gretchen's disappearance had not been the result of some random crime or a bizarre incident. He told police that he had planned it all. The confession was chilling. David explained that his relationship with Gretchen had begun to unravel long before the Zoom call. He admitted to being controlling, manipulative, and at times, violent. Gretchen had begun to distance herself from him. She had spoken about breaking up, and for David, this was a breaking point. He said that he felt betrayed. The idea of losing her was unbearable. That night, he had lured her into a false sense of security. They had planned to have a quiet night at home, but instead, David attacked Gretchen, taking her life in a brutal act of violence. He then staged her disappearance, hoping to mislead her family and friends. David had sent the texts from Gretchen's phone, hoping to make it seem as though she had just vanished on her own, running away from everything. But his plan had backfired. The texts were clearly not from Gretchen, and the evidence was stacking up against him. David was arrested, and the case took a tragic turn. Gretchen was gone, and her family was left with the painful realization that the person they had trusted most in her life was the one who had caused her death. Despite David's confession, Gretchen's body was still missing. Investigators knew that they had to find her to bring closure to the case, but it was no easy task. David had been careful to dispose of her body in a way that would make it nearly impossible to find. However, the police were relentless. They continued to search the area around the remote location where Gretchen's belongings had been found, hoping to find a lead. It wasn't until a week later that the breakthrough came. A team of detectives and searchers combed the dense woods near a secluded area on the outskirts of town. There, hidden in a shallow grave, they found the body of Gretchen Anthony. It was a devastating discovery for her family, but it was also the final piece of evidence needed to confirm the brutal crime that had been committed. Her family was heartbroken, but they were also relieved to finally have the truth. Gretchen's life had been taken from her in the most senseless of ways. With the discovery of Gretchen's body, the investigation took a deeper, darker turn. The authorities began to uncover more details about David's life, and what they found was chilling. David had been living a double life, manipulating not just Gretchen, but others around him as well. His past was filled with red flags that had been overlooked by those who were closest to him. He had a history of abusive behavior, and his ex-partners had tried to warn others about his controlling nature. In the months leading up to Gretchen's death, David had shown signs of desperation. His emotional instability was apparent. He had become more erratic, more obsessed with the idea of keeping Gretchen in his life, regardless of her wishes. The police found that he had removed any personal belongings of hers that might have tied her to the house after her death. He tried to make it seem like she had simply walked away from her life, but it was clear that his plan had been anything but perfect. As the trial date neared, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution had a solid case against David. His confession, the evidence, and the shocking details of the crime all pointed to his guilt. But David's defense team was determined to fight back, claiming that he had acted out of fear and confusion. They argued that he had been overwhelmed by the pressure of the relationship and had acted in a fit of rage. The prosecution, however, painted a much darker picture of David's actions. They argued that Gretchen's death was the culmination of a pattern of control and manipulation that had been brewing for months. David wasn't acting out of fear, he was acting out of anger, jealousy, and a desperate desire to keep Gretchen under his control. The trial was a long and emotional ordeal for Gretchen's family. They were forced to relive every detail of her tragic death. The defense's arguments only served to deepen their pain. But throughout the trial, Gretchen's family remained strong, determined to get justice for the woman they loved. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. David Anthony was found guilty of the murder of Gretchen Anthony. The courtroom erupted in emotion as the verdict was read. For Gretchen's family, it was a bittersweet moment. While they were relieved that justice had been served, it didn't bring their loved one back. The tragic story of Gretchen Anthony is one of heartbreak and horror. It is a reminder that domestic violence can happen to anyone, and that sometimes, the person closest to you can be the one who causes the most harm. Her story has inspired others to seek help, to break free from controlling relationships, and to stand up against violence. Thank you for watching. Our hearts go out to the families of the victims, those who lost their loved ones in such a horrific way. No words can ease that pain, but by telling their stories, we honor their memory and seek justice through truth.